Who has the best character arc? That seems like an impossible question to answer given the immense roster of characters, but we have to take into account how each character evolves through the entire show. Even seasons 7 and 8, where character assassinations are numerous and plentiful. So first, let's whittle down the main characters who had the greatest potential for arcs that were ultimately fumbled, and from there, we can determine who has the best overall character arc. The first one that comes to mind is easily Daenerys Targaryen. I think the general arc in writing where a protagonist turns into an antagonist has the most captivating growth. You're taking a character that's inherently lovable and forcing them down a path that corrupts them. It's an interesting narrative proposition because you're sympathizing with the character while they turn evil, as that's a big part of making intriguing villains because understanding where they're coming from is a foundation of garnering sympathy within your audience. So theoretically for Dany, this arc should be incredible, and there are other factors that increase the quality, like the weight of her lineage, her turn subverts the generic hero archetype, and her relationship with Jon Snow deeply conflicts everything in the narrative. However, David and Dan squander what is otherwise an easy layup provided by George R.R. Martin and rush this entire arc in the span of a single shortened season, most of which isn't even spent on this turn. We needed a lot more time to actually get Daenerys into a proper headspace to forsake everything that she ever stood for. Game of Thrones used to be a show built on riveting and complex character building that made us care deeply for everyone, and Season 8 forgoes all of that for a rushed, fast-paced plot that prioritizes action, utterly severing the connection of sympathy and understanding the audience has for Dany, as her turn feels more contrived than a natural progression. Jon Snow. I feel his first 5 seasons have a pretty great arc where a boy who lacks an identity finds himself and becomes a true leader. But once David and Dan run out of source material for him in season 6, Jon's character development basically hits a brick wall. Getting resurrected chips away at your inner soul? Let's not explore that in a deeper character introspection. He mostly just becomes a plot device to push the story forward as David and Dan use his character to carry out their idiotic objectives. All of his character struggle in regards to being king of the north and a fucking Targaryen is met with, I don't want it and I don't care. It's essentially only used to create conflict in Dany and Jon's relationship. A relationship, by the way, that's so forced that it happens in like 3 brief scenes and they're magically in love. Jon flat out doesn't have enough character development in the later seasons to even consider him as having a solid arc throughout the show. Tyrion Lannister. This is a conflicting character because his arc is entirely inverted from his book counterpart, where he becomes extremely spiteful and wants to lay waste to his entire house. If seasons 5 through 8 followed that model, then I think Tyrion could have had a way more interesting arc, instead of becoming a generic good guy who wants to save the realm. He goes from one of the most interesting characters in seasons 1 through 4, showcasing excellent growth of increasing confidence and power, to a mundane husk of what he used to be. His later season arc essentially dismantles all of his development and turns his character into a jaded, cynical man who has done nothing but fail his queen. Which in of itself is a weird direction to take his character, and is only done because David and Dan had to nerf Daenerys to plausibly allow Cersei to survive until season 8. Arya Stark. Probably one of the most upsettingly fumbled arcs in the show given how much potential it had. A lone wolf in a hostile world desperately looking for connection and community, and is only met with hostility. And along that grueling journey, she becomes more audacious, resilient, and at the end, a faceless assassin. Although, the whole Faceless Assassin arc was riddled with hilariously absurd moments, and a plot that falls apart if you think about it for more than 2 minutes. So, Arya's growth in the last 2 seasons is basically just a very stripped down and underdeveloped revenge arc. It's hard to even classify her ending arc because she's all over the place. In one season, she's threatening to kill Sansa over the most silly reasons, and in the other, she kills the Night King with her flying powers. David and Dan sacrifice any consistent character growth to have characters fulfill plot requirements that don't make sense for them to do. But looking at her actual revenge arc, Sandor basically just says, "You'll die here, don't be like me," and that works to convince her to forsake this ever-consuming looming quest, which we should all know by this point that revenge is ever blinding. Arya wouldn't care about what he says here, since she's idolized killing Cersei all her life. This is basically her getting revenge for her father, and she's just like, oh okay, I'll leave because I might die. Killing all the Freys and bypassing a castle worth of guards definitely wasn't as dangerous as this. It's such a rushed moment that relies on the character easily being swayed and with no argumentation. In an ideal story environment, this confrontation should have happened in a normal dialogue scene, and I went more in depth about how this arc should have played out in my last video. But hey, revenge and genocide doesn't have consequences. You go explore what's west of Westeros and die of starvation or from whatever the hell is out there. Sansa Stark. I don't think I even have to explain in depth why Sansa's arc was so botched. To put simply, her entire showcase season actively communicated the opposite for what David and Dan wanted her character to be. They tried to make her intelligent, bold, and a master player at the Game of Thrones. However, all of that was contradicted by her literally doing the opposite, like still trusting Littlefinger, almost being convinced into killing her sister, and overtly and brazenly beefing with Daenerys Targaryen just because of her name. What happened to all the scheming, backstabbing, and hiding your true intentions? This would be like in season 1 if Littlefinger approached Ned and said he wasn't his ally. Oh wait, that actually happened, but at least it was in a joking manner. David and Dan wanted an adept and cunning female queen molded by Cersei and Littlefinger, and instead they created a disrespectful buffoon. Bran Stark. Clearly he has the best arc because Tyrion said so, but ironically, it's easily the least interesting arc. So interesting in fact that David and Dan chose to not give Bran any screen time or character development in season 5. We had to sit through his long journey only to not get any kind of progression or training for becoming the three-eyed raven. A bare minimum for writing 101 is having consistent growth for your characters, especially at the most pivotal point for their journey. You have to flesh out his skills, training, and include an internal arc associated with becoming one of the strongest beings in the realm. David and Dan opt to not write any of this and turn him into a comatose vegetable who I guess loses all empathy and most of his brain functionality. Sandor Clegane. Another example of David and Dan having a character go on a great arc during the book seasons, and then completely fumble them moving forward. That's definitely not a coincidence. As much as I love Sandor, bringing him back was nothing more than fan service. It feels like David and Dan wanted to include him in every major set piece without sitting down and questioning if the character would actually do this. Joining the Brotherhood without banners? He hates them, doesn't believe in the gods, and has an active disdain and fear for fire. I get that Sandor has embraced a peaceful life, but it's a pretty significant leap for his character to become a literal hero. In reality, he'd probably screw off somewhere, and the only plausible way for him to be present in Winterfell is wanting to protect Arya. Maybe. But him learning about that wouldn't happen. That's why his arc ends, at least in the books, with him becoming someone who finds solace and being a mute gravedigger after his grievous wounds at the end. It's a perfect end to a character who lived through such a tormented and hateful life. And the show basically just glues him to the main plot and fabricates this notion that Sandor needs to kill Gregor, which it's like, he hates him, but I doubt he'd realistically go on a massive revenge quest to kill him. If that was the case, then why hasn't he done so earlier in his life? It feels like David and Dan forgot to give Sandor a tangible personal objective and then just threw this in. His ending is the epitome of fan service that basically just indulges in the fans obsessing over Clegane Bull. His actual death I think is fine, but the story is utterly compromised to get him to this point. This leaves a few characters to choose from that have the best and most consistent overall character arc, which are Theon Greyjoy, Jaime Lannister, and Samwell Tarly. Sam's arc, though, is a bit compromised as it features a craven turned into a brave man, but in order to punctuate that point, he has to survive the long night, and the only logical way for that to happen is by having ridiculous plot armor. If you actually wanted him surviving to make sense, then he should have been up on the walls with Davos, trying to apply battle strategy with his wits, and not utilizing his legendary skills as a fighter. Like, it's completely asinine that Samwell is holding his own on the front lines, while the Unsullied get cut through like paper. They could have made his arc way better if he dies saving someone. Like, ideally, I think the best ending for Sam is he rushes into the crypts when he sees the Night King raising the dead and saves Gilly. But in doing so, he gets killed. This acts as a more succinct arc to his character becoming brave, and removes the whole silly fan service ending of him becoming a first-year Grand Maester on the Small Council. So this kind of leaves Theon and Jaime, and the contest between these two characters for who has the better arc is actually kind of tough. Because I think Theon's arc is more consistent, while Jaime just barely loses some of that consistency towards the end, with a quite terrible ending for his character. But in terms of arc quality, Jaime hits way bigger highs than Theon to the point that I can kind of forgive the sloppy ending for Jaime. And addressing that bad ending, David and Dan relating Jaime's relationship with Cersei as being like a drug and he relapses and goes back to her is really odd.
He's got almost an addiction to Cersei that he just can't break. So even though he's given a kind of a chance at happiness and some kind of different life for himself, he makes the choice to go back to Cersei.
The books clearly make a point that these twins are slowly becoming more repulsed by each other in each passing chapter. Their love has withered away, and that is kind of present in the show at the end of season 7, where Cersei betrays Jaime's trust, forcing him to choose between her or doing the right thing, to which he chooses the latter and simultaneously confesses his feelings for Brienne. So Jaime suddenly ejecting himself out of this better life and flying back to Cersei like a supersonic missile so they can run away and live together forever is jarring to say the least. This compared to Theon's ending is a pretty major difference, where there, it acts as clever irony that Theon ultimately dies protecting Bran, a perfect end to his overall redemption arc. Now, to be fair, I don't think even a chimpanzee could mess up this ending for Theon, but even though I said his arc is more consistent than Jaime's, it's still not flawless. His season 7 and beginning of season 8 screen time is a bit puzzling. David and Dan set up this notion that Theon succumbs to his PTSD of Reek and leaves Yara behind. A moment that doesn't make sense on its own given that Euron could have still captured him, but for this mini arc, it needs a strong payoff of Theon triumphantly getting his sister back, ideally in a manner in which he overcomes and defeats Euron, or at the very least, injures him. This lack of tangible and satisfying payoff is frustrating because Theon's ending to season 7 was actually good. He embraces his inherent weakness and rallies the Ironborn as Theon Greyjoy. So the fact that this leads to Theon teleporting onto the ship containing Yara and he quickly extracts her with no conflict is baffling writing. You have mostly solid setup and terrible payoff. It feels like David and Dan had bigger plans for Theon and then changed their minds and wanted to get him back to Winterfell as fast as possible. So that's Theon's biggest flaw, and I'm also personally not a big fan of his Reek tenure, since it goes on for a long time, but more so because it feels like he's waiting for the surrounding story to advance and allow his character to evolve. Then for Jaime, before highlighting his excellent arc, I'll briefly address seasons 5 and 6.
Jaime fucking Lannister.
The Dorne subplot was rancidly abysmal from a story perspective, but I don't think Jaime's character was ruined beyond repair. I can buy this as something he'd be down to do, even though it's very dumb. The biggest flaw in that regard character-wise is David and Dan stretching how plausibly stupid Jaime is. Like, he oftentimes can be a bit short-sighted, but it's another thing entirely just improving a kidnap heist in a foreign kingdom. Outside of the logic of this plotline, Jaime does have some great character moments like his final scene with Myrcella that was really cathartic. Season 6 is also pretty solid for him, mostly because it's a stripped-down adaptation of his time in A Feast for Crows. So David and Dan were able to lean on the source material for Jaime this season, and at least had some strong moments. Although most of the characterization from the book feels kind of lost, and is traded out for Jaime and Bronn quipping on the road. Suffice to say, Jaime in seasons 5 through 7 wasn't ruined, he just wasn't written nearly as bad as most of the other characters were. With the later seasons out of the way, this leaves Jaime's core spectacular arc of a seemingly evil, arrogant, and disgraceful knight going down a path that reinvigorates his sense of honor and morality. We open the show hating this character. He tried to kill Bran Stark, so getting to a point where we ultimately love this character is a massive narrative feat. From a writing perspective, this narrative proposition is uncovering all the complex layers to his character and seeing if there is something redeemable within Jaime, something that he has buried deep down under his Kingslayer persona, a dichotomy that in of itself is extremely interesting because he's so tired of being lamented as a villain that he just embraces that evil persona. It wears him down and he slowly starts to lose sight of actual goodness and a decent morality. However, in that first season, you can sense something partially good within him in minor ways. He chooses to not kill Ned Stark in an unhonorable fashion, there's a bit of opposition between him and his father, and you can really feel his inner virtue during his talk with Ned Stark, where Jaime brings up that he killed an evil and vicious man, but Ned is so held up on the technicalities of being honorable that he fails to see the goodness in Jaime's actions. This now indirectly raises a thought-provoking question of, does your own inaction in the face of injustice make you a bad person? Because according to Ned's logic, no matter what happens, you have to stay honorable to your oaths. This philosophy also applies to Sir Barristan Selmy, a character that is universally pointed to as the most honorable knight in the realm, whom everyone loves. However, he stood by while the Mad King killed people just because the voices told him to. At what point does your honor to the king override your duties of knighthood? This general notion of the complexities and greatness of honor and conflicting oaths supercharges Jaime's journey into being the standout arc in the show, which this is just how his arc synergizes with one of the most interesting themes in Game of Thrones. How this plays out over the course of the show is just as incredible. I love how George methodically orchestrates every event to bring out Jaime's dormant good side. He first gets captured, and this is a major convention break because you assume this is going to be a character that'll be a constant villain presence. But the fact that he's captured right away signals that George has greater internal goals for this character. It's the first time he properly tastes defeat, and it acts as a reality check. He's put in a position that physically disarms him, and he's forced to talk to people outside of his personal circle. They challenge his ideals, and he counters them with his own brutal and realistic outlook on Westeros culture and religion.
If your gods are real, and if they're just, why is the world so full of injustice?
This leads to an audience perception shift that essentially prepares us for his upcoming arc. He's not a flat-out villain here, and there's more nuance being alluded to under the surface. So Catelyn tasks Jaime with bringing back her daughters, and she does this predominantly out of desperation, not because she actually believes Jaime is honorable, and this operates more as an unlikely Hail Mary. Jaime makes this oath, but deep down, he has no intentions on being faithful to this promise. It's another raindrop in a hurricane of conflicting oaths. So what makes this upcoming arc so compelling is that George takes a character who's in this state and completely reverses that stance by the end of season 3. The way he does this is through a brilliant character pairing. Brienne's purity and utter insistence on being honorable kind of reinvigorates that buried good side in Jaime. He did once have these intentions and ideals as all beginner knights do, but given certain dark and cruel events, those ideals quickly diminished. Along with the notion of honorable knights being heavily diluted by people who aren't worthy of that title, as the process of knighting in Westeros is mostly used as a reward system. Even Bronn, a sellsword, becomes a knight in this story. But going back to Jaime's arc, at first, Brienne disgusts Jaime, and their pairing alone won't get Jaime to a point of bettering himself. There are some moments in which Jaime comes to respect Brienne, but he'd still gladly kill her like most people at this point, as he generally sees killing people to fulfill his goal as a necessity. So on top of having this pairing, George throws an unexpected wrench into Jaime's arc in that he loses his sword hand. His biggest skill and asset is suddenly gone. Jaime now has to confront what he so often runs away from. He used to cut down his problems, he'd threatened to kill people, but that all vanishes in an instant. His Kingslayer persona basically dies in this moment. This leaves Jaime in a raw state and isn't motivated to keep living, highlighting how his meaning in life was his skill as a warrior. But Brienne shatters that notion and convinces him to persist by basically calling him a coward for giving up. It's the epitome of weakness, and this fundamental challenge from Brienne pulls Jaime from the brink of collapse. This realization in Spark heavily endears Jaime to Brienne. She kind of imbues meaning back into his life. This eventually leads to the iconic bath scene where Jaime fully reveals the secret that Arya Targaryen was going to destroy King's Landing. This recontextualizes everything, and you can make an argument that Jaime is the biggest hero in the story because of this. We now have immense sympathy for how poorly everyone treated him, and his spiral downwards and the negative things that brought about feel more justified than they were before. So now that these two characters have bonded, it instills a sense of kinship in their relationship, and George forces Jaime into a situation where he has to save Brienne. A moment that solidifies that his honorable side and higher morality is back. Once he returns to King's Landing, his dynamic with Cersei feels changed. They don't click with one another, and my interpretation of that is Cersei was in love with the Kingslayer and not the real Jaime. I think this is still partially true in the show, it just takes longer for Jaime's more honorable ideals to clash with Cersei's psychopathic intentions. Especially since Jaime is still mostly vindicated in the sense that he's fighting for House Lannister throughout seasons 5 through 7. But along the way, he still proves that he's not unnecessarily evil. I think the division between Cersei and Jaime is drawn out, but David and Dan still get there in the end, and of course, I hate his ending because it basically nukes all of his development. So Jaime's arc hits major high points, and his overall character I think personifies what I like about the show the most. While Theon hard peaks in season 2, with how deeply conflicted and torn apart he is between the identities of Stark and Greyjoy, but after season 2, he doesn't come close to this point again. Still though, he is a very close second for who has the best character arc in Game of Thrones. There are technically other side characters who have development, but that doesn't really compare to, say, POV characters, along with antagonists who don't really have internal character arcs. Let me know in the comments which character has your favorite overall arc, and make sure to follow my Letterboxd, join the channel Discord for discussions and video notifications, and I also have a Patreon if you want to support the channel and get some rewards. Thank you so much to my top patron Logan Farmer for being the best.